Please welcome to the stage former Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Sally Yates, and founding partner, SellersEaston Media, Nina Easton.
Where do you want me?
Well, it's such an honor. I don't know if I'm on. Can you guys hear me? My mic is now on. It's great to be here. It is such an honor to be here with Sally Yates, who we had at our Fortune Most Powerful Women Summit last week. You were awesome, so thank you for doing this.
Well, I had a great time last week, and I'm glad to be here today. Thank you for having me.
So let's start a little bit. I always like to do what I like to call the big get to know you. I feel like my mic's not on, but you guys can let me know if it's not. You have a long career, of course, with the Justice Department, but you come from a family of lawyers and judges, and tell us about your family legacy.
Well, there are a whole lot of lawyers, probably people would say way too many in my family. My father, both of my grandfathers, uncle, cousins, but most strikingly, my grandmother, my father's mother, was one of the earliest women admitted to the Georgia bar. But this was back in the 40s, back at a time when you could, what was known as reading law under another lawyer. She didn't go to law school. She apprenticed under another lawyer for quite some time and studied and then took the bar exam and passed the bar. But you know, this is the South back in the 40s and 50s, and there weren't a whole lot of women practicing law in Georgia at that time.
I can imagine.
So yeah, she ended up being the secretary to my grandfather and then later to my father and his brother when they were practicing. And you know, I've told folks before, truth be told, she was a lot smarter than all of them put together. And it must have been so frustrating for her to be the one there typing their thoughts as opposed to arguing her own.
Did she ever talk to you about that?
You know, she was a no-nonsense kind of woman, so she was not the type to get all gushy or moany about things like that. She was frustrated by it, but it was kind of like, that's the way it is, so this is what I need to do to be part of this world, and that's what she did.
And was the expectation always that you were going to be a lawyer?
Well, no, actually, you know, that's one of the things I think is so hard for kids these days. I sound like a really old person when I say that, is that, you know, we have this expectation that our children or folks that are in college are going to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives when they're 18 years old. When I graduated from college, I didn't want to be a lawyer, I didn't want to be married to a lawyer, and I really didn't want to have a lot of lawyer friends.
Why? Why?
I was just, I mean, to me, I think it's that I didn't want to follow in the expected path.
Okay.
And so...
You do have that little rebellious streak
yeah, so
early on. We would see later, by the way. Okay.
Yeah, so my way of rebelling was not being a lawyer. How edgy of me. But that only lasted about 2 years, and then I succumbed. And actually was so glad I did, because when I went to law school, you know how I will lose all credibility with you when I tell you that I loved law school, but I loved law school. It was like it
How
all
many of you
made
loved
sense.
law school? Could you raise?
Oh, yay!
Look at that.
Some fellow
How many
nerds,
of you
thank you.
really did not love law school? Oh, just a handful. Okay. Law school gets a bad rap.
Yeah, but I did. I loved it. It made sense. It was the way I thought. I felt like I was good at it. I liked my classmates a lot. I really liked the people there. They were smart and engaged and funny and fun to hang out with. And so I loved law school, but even then, I had no sense that I wanted to practice criminal law. Once again, sort of this idea that you know in law school what kind of law you want to practice. I didn't. In fact, I didn't even take many criminal law classes, which probably would concern some of you considering the job I ended up with.
That is kind of disconcerting. Wow, okay.
And it wasn't until I went to private practice. This may be more than you want to know.
No, I want to know this. This is interesting. This is like Christine Lagarde telling us that she was bad in math.
I was bad in math too, so So I was in private practice for a few years, and I actually didn't hate private practice. I liked it. I was having a really good experience there, but I wanted something that I felt like was more impactful and more meaningful. And I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta expecting that I would stay there for a few years and then go back to the firm. And 27 years later, I was still at DOJ after having had a variety of different positions in the department and then also up at Main Justice, and just absolutely became taken with the mission at DOJ and the type of work that we had and the impact that I felt like that we were having, and couldn't think of a reason why I would want to do anything else.
Give us some of the most impactful moments during those early years.
You know, it's not necessarily in the big headline-grabbing cases. You know, I'm sure are there folks here who have been AUSAs before? Nobody? Wow, that's one. Oh, current AUSA? No, sorry. I was going to make you stand up right now. You know, when you're a prosecutor, you're obviously dealing with the issue of someone's liberty here. This is not just fighting about money. And look, fighting about money can be important too. I don't mean that, but you're talking about whether you're going to take away someone's liberty. And so that's a really consequential decision. And then how you go about doing that prosecution oftentimes matters as much as what the end result is and whether you decide to bring charges or not bring charges. And particularly, I did a lot of public corruption work when I was in AUSA, and those are cases where oftentimes the investigation and prosecution is on trial just as much as the defendant is. And so, and that's, you know, can be sort of what becomes defining in terms of whether people have confidence in the Justice Department and in their U.S. Attorney's Office. And so it was in the sort of everyday decisions that you would be making there where you realized when you made a decision to bring charges, and I was doing predominantly white-collar work in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you realized you were changing that person's, hitting on your earring. Oh, sorry about that. I wonder if that was
Mics and jewelry just don't go together. It drives stage producers crazy.
Now I feel like a game show host holding this. I even forgot what I was talking. So you realize that the decisions that you're making, even just the decision to bring charges, will change this person's life forever and his or her family's life forever. But at the same time, you also recognize that you have a really awesome responsibility to be enforcing the law and to be representing the people of the United States. And I know that sounds incredibly corny to talk about representing the people of the United States, but I really believe that that is the responsibility of every single lawyer at the Department of Justice.
But when you joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, 1989?
Yeah, a long time ago.
You told me you felt a little bit like a fish out of water for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, well, back at that time, and I really am sounding like the old fogey now, in Atlanta, in contrast to, say, New York or Boston or some of the cities more in the Northeast, it was unusual at that point for someone to come from a big firm to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's not the case now, and certainly it changed pretty quickly, certainly in the 90s. But back in the late 80s, it was mostly people coming from DA's offices. So I remember at the time when I joined the office, there was a gentleman that was one of the AUSAs, the supervisors there. He was kind of uneasy with the idea that this woman from, as he called it, a silk stocking firm was going to come to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I, at that time, thought that I wanted to do work that was called strike force work, organized crime work. And he didn't want me in that group. He thought, you'll be dealing with these unseemly people, and he thought that it might just be a little too rough and tumble for someone who was coming from the rarefied environs of a big Atlanta firm. And he never said the sort of woman thing, but that was kind of wrapped up in all of it there. And while particularly looking back on that, that's really annoying. that he was making this decision for me. It's you got to kind of remember the context of the times, and it was very paternalistic on his part, but he thought he was helping me out, and sent me to white collar instead, which I will begrudgingly admit was the right place for me, because that was the work that I absolutely found most challenging and interesting, and so
What did you
really
find challenging? What did you like about it?
Well, in white-collar work, the issue is not whether the defendant did what he or she is accused of doing. Usually, it's pretty clear they did it. The question is, what were they thinking at the time they did it? What was their intent? Because criminal intent is really the issue for most all white-collar crimes. I find that a lot more challenging and interesting and intriguing to try to unravel that puzzle.
So there's more of a psychological aspect to it in some ways.
It's not like, it's not like a bank robber where you've got a videotape, and so you know whether this person robbed the bank or not. This is more challenging in that regard.
Interesting. So as a woman, did you ever feel like you had to pull your punches in front of juries or anything?
Back, again, it was a long time ago. When I first started...
Some of these issues are still around last time we checked, like this week, so...
I think it is. Hopefully it is different now. But I remember when I first started trying cases, and for the other female AUSAs that were in the office, and you kind of wanted to make sure, more with juries than anybody else, that particularly the female jurors were comfortable with you. This was sort of at the height of, well, I guess some would call the mommy wars, where there was tension between women who worked outside the home and women who chose not to. And I think I was always conscious then of wanting to make sure that if I had women on the jury who did not work outside the home, that they never felt like I was in some way superior to them. I know that probably some of you all may be sort of perplexed that you even had to think about that, but this was, it was a little bit of a different time then. I think it has evolved, hopefully some now, and it's not as much of an issue, but I do remember at the time sort of feeling like you needed to modulate a little bit and to kind of make sure you didn't come on too strong.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which hopefully is not something women have to worry about anymore. I can remember actually being here in D.C. On the day of the Women's March. And I was acting AG, so it wasn't really appropriate for me to be in the Women's March. But I was actually at the Whole Foods late that afternoon as the march was concluding, and there were just tons of women pouring into Whole Foods afterwards because the metro was overflowing and there was really no place for women to go, and it was just brutally cold. And it was lots of young women with signs and the hats and the whole thing. And I remember just sort of stepping back and watching for a while, and watching these young women totally comfortable in their own skin, very confident of what they believed and their expression of it, and just thinking, this is good. This is how it's supposed to be, regardless of what your ideological views might be, that women now feel much more empowered and comfortable to be able to express those views and not be pulling any punches.
Times have changed, and during those decades, and you of course skyrocketed to national recognition in 10 days. But before we get to those 10 days...
Yeah, there was a 27 years before that.
Exactly. I mean, I don't think people in this room... Yeah, there's... What do you think of as your legacy in those 27 years, pre-January, at the Justice Department? What would you... what are you most proud of having achieved? How do you think people viewed your strengths?
I don't mean to sound coy here. I don't think it's up to me to say what my legacy is. I think, that's for others, and it may be different perspectives on that. I would hope that some of the things that people might say about my tenure, both from the time, from when I was an AUSA to U.S. Attorney in Atlanta to later Deputy Attorney General, and then that 10-day period. I hope that people would say that I really took the responsibility that I was entrusted with very seriously. I mean, I took that responsibility seriously when I was in AUSA and was making decisions that would have the kind of impact that I just described. I took it seriously when I was U.S. Attorney and had to try to figure out how we were going to deploy our limited resources in our district to try to have the greatest impact on public safety in our district. I took it seriously when I was DAG and was trying to, in the narrow window of time we had, to get as much done as we possibly could. And then in those last 10 days, when I had some decisions I did not expect to have, but had some decisions that I had to make, that I took my responsibility to represent the people of the United States and to uphold the law and the Constitution seriously, whether one agrees on a legal basis with the decision that I made or not. I think reasonable people can have different views, and I respect that, but I was in the chair at the time, and I needed to make the decisions that I felt like were true to that oath. And so that's what I did.
And Sally, I know you don't want to dwell on those 10 days because your life is bigger than those 10 days. But I do want to get at how you approach difficult decisions under this intense scrutiny and an intense short period of time. So you became acting Attorney General, and the first big issue to hit your desk was General Flynn. Tell us, just remind everybody what you were facing.
Okay, well, I have to be somewhat circumspect here because despite the fact there's been a lot of public discussion about this, the facts underlying much of this still remain classified. Yeah. And so even
you wouldn't know that in this town.
No, you really wouldn't. And so even when I testified before the Senate, for example, I would not discuss what as I called it, the underlying conduct was of General Flynn's, but sort of just in a brief nutshell, we learned about some information of some conduct that General Flynn had been involved in that we felt like compromised him with the Russians, and that he had been providing misleading information to other members of the White House, including Vice President Pence, who were also going out and providing that false information then to the American public. And this was information that, as far as we knew, the White House did not have. And it seemed pretty obvious to us that the White House needed to know about this so that they could take action with respect to General Flynn.
And the concern was the Russians? I mean, not just the contact with the Russians, but what the Russians could do with the information.
Sure.
Just to remind people.
Yeah. There were a couple of concerns, both his underlying conduct, that I'm coyly not telling you what it was, but his underlying conduct was problematic in and of itself. Right. And then the fact that he had lied about it, and those false statements had been publicly disseminated by others in the White House, put him in a position with the Russians where he was compromised, where they could hold that over his head.
So the decision to go to the White House with this information, was that a no-brainer, or did you kind of wrestle that out with your staff? I mean, how did you approach that decision?
Well, it wasn't just with my staff, it was with the other components of the intelligence community as well, the Director of National Intelligence and the CIA and others. And there were a variety of factors that we had to balance at the time, and I think we've testified about the fact that General Flynn was under investigation at that time as well, and so you have to balance the impact on an investigation from a timing standpoint. But, no-brainer is it was absolutely, we felt like essential, clear, okay. Yeah, that they needed to know. The question was a question of timing and how it was going to be conveyed and to whom would it be conveyed and all of those issues.
And the response from the White House was?
Well, I've testified about that, and it was, how would I describe it at first? They certainly seemed somewhat surprised. The first day that I told them about it, I went to see Don McGahn, who's the White House counsel. And then the second day that I went back, a bit more defensive of the actions. And then there was a weekend, and then the travel ban happened over the weekend. And then by Monday evening, I was no longer with DOJ. So
before you
I didn't
were
have a lot of, yeah.
before you were
So we didn't have a lot more discussion after that.
And so there was one other issue. One other issue. So again, these 10 days, which I think somebody said to you, it was going to be long, boozy lunches because you know, what does an acting attorney general do? Maybe you said that.
Yeah, it's supposed to be status quo during this time. Nothing is supposed to change.
You're just supposed to
during
be
the time that you're
a
acting.
chair warmer, basically. And again, just briefly to remind people, the travel ban happened, and again, I'm wondering how you approached that decision, remind everybody what your decision was, but just how you approached that.
Well, the decision in this instance was, and I'll try to keep this very brief, was that this was travel ban 1. We're on travel ban 3.0 now, so it's kind of hard to remember back to what the parameters were of the first travel ban, but that was announced just 7 days into the administration. And this travel ban excluded individuals from 6 predominantly Muslim countries. And at the point I made my decision, actually even included people who were lawful permanent residents of the United States, LPRs, as well as people who had valid visas. And so without going into, I can't sort of talk about the internal discussions with the Department of Justice, but I learned about this Friday night. We wrestled with it over the weekend, had lengthier discussions on Monday, and at the conclusion of all of that, I was not convinced that the travel ban was lawful or constitutional, and I also believed that it would require us to send lawyers of the Department of Justice into court to argue something that was not grounded in truth. That being specifically that the travel ban had absolutely nothing to do with religion. And so then the issue is, do you resign or do you direct? And the decision there kind of came back to, I guess, some of the things I talked about at the beginning, and that is, I remembered my confirmation hearing where a number of the senators were asking me then about what will you do if the president asks you to do something that's unlawful?
And let's remind people, that was 2015.
And so it was a different president that we're talking
Trump,
about. Yeah, it was President Obama. They didn't say, will you resign if the president asks you to do something unlawful? They asked me, will you say no? And so I felt like to do my job, I needed to say no. I wouldn't call it a no-brainer because certainly I struggled with the issue of whether I should resign or whether I should direct. But in the end, look, there wasn't a whole lot of time to make this decision. This is all happening over like 72 hours. But I think just like all of you, when you're making serious decisions in your practices, you don't make those decisions just within the confine of the time that you have. You draw on your experiences over the course of your practice in your lifetime. You draw on the principles that you used in making decisions all along the way in your career. And those are the things that animate the process that you go through in making a decision in those crunch moments.
And you had the near-term prospect. You had to send lawyers in to argue.
Yeah.
So you had a decision you had to make quickly.
The next morning, on Monday, I was advised that the next day we would have to take a position on the constitutionality of the statute.
So what have you learned from those, not just from those 10 days, but from those months following? What have you learned, what lessons have you learned, and what have you learned about the institutions of the United States of America?
Well, I thought back to sort of the time when I was an AUSA and U.S. Attorney, and particularly during the time I was Deputy Attorney General, what euphemistically known as DAG. One of the things I would always tell folks around me, whether I was U.S. Attorney or DAG, is that I didn't want them to give me the safest advice. I wanted them to give me the best advice. And we all know as lawyers, our job is to try to minimize risk. That's what we do. And when you counsel your clients, whether it's internally or if you're outside counsel, your job is to let them know what the risks are and oftentimes to try to steer them away from those. But ultimately, it is up to the policymaker, it's up to your clients to decide what level of risk they want to take on, because oftentimes the safest course is not the best course, and that big things rarely happen by taking the safest course. And that can be a difficult thing. When I was Deputy Attorney General, it was actually kind of good that we had a limited window of time. We only had 2 years from the time that I was there. And so we had the urgency of a deadline. And I wanted to do more than just sort of process the things that were coming across my desk. I wanted to also look at those things that we felt like we needed to be doing differently at DOJ and to try to push the department as far as we could, as quickly as we could in those 2 years. And so I had to embolden the people around me, which included the assistant AGs for all of the different divisions. It included my staff. It included the U.S. attorneys, to be willing to take a risk, to look at what they felt like needed to be done, and not to be, I don't mean to be reckless or irresponsible, absolutely not, but to look at it and to be willing to weigh the risk there and to be willing to be wrong.
Do you say that to your
Yeah,
you use that word risk, willing to be wrong.
Yeah, and that means when they come in and they're giving you the options, you certainly want to know what the risks are that are attendant to those different options. But it doesn't mean that every single time you default to the safest way. And I think we all know people like that, that'll always give you the safest advice. And sometimes the safest advice is that's least likely to come back and bite you later. Wow, what an unsatisfying way to live or to practice. Yeah. And you don't really find that those people are sometimes a whole lot of help to you when you're trying to manage an organization. And so, but you also have to free up, I think, the people around you to know that that's what you expect of them, that you expect them to be thinking of what is the best course, not just the safest course, and to be giving you that advice. And again, to be telling you what the risks are that go with that.
Is that hard with lawyers? Are they,
yeah,
do they default to the safest advice?
I think we're naturally kind of risk-averse people because that's how we're trained, and that's part of what our job is. And again, I'm not in any way suggesting we go out there and just do crazy stuff. But you know, it can be a really freeing thing for your staffs to know that you want them to be thinking creatively, that you want them to be looking for what could be done. You know, maybe it doesn't work out, but if we were to try this, they've got to feel safe, though, to be able to make those decisions and sometimes be wrong on their own. And they need to feel safe to be able to give you the advice sometimes that may ultimately not work out as well.
So speaking of risk, let's talk about new chapters in your life. I know you're not a political person. However, you now have been thrown into the public spotlight. You believe in public service. The question keeps coming, are you going to run for office? I know my partner, Patty Sellers, who couldn't be here, and myself have kind of insisted that you are charismatic and a leader, and that's something that you should really think of.
Thank you. Yeah. That's very nice.
And I know you're not going to give me a clear answer, but how do you approach?
Well, I would. It's just probably not the answer you want.
Okay, okay. And how do you approach a life decision like that?
You know, I think one of the things is that you have to know yourself in making these decisions, and I will tell you that I do believe in public service. I mean, I never would have stayed at the Department of Justice for as long as I did if I didn't feel really drawn to that work and find it really satisfying and challenging and just believe in my core that's what I should be doing. Running for office has a whole different gloss on that. And from my perspective, they're kind of people who've always known that's what they've wanted to do. They've always wanted to run for office. I am not one of those people. I have never felt drawn to elective office. I still don't feel drawn to elective office. Public service, yes, but running for office is, you know, not something I can really see. My husband feels otherwise. He really wants me to and keeps saying, just don't say never. You know, when people ask you this question. So, but I have a hard time picturing that.
And What other chapters are you looking at?
A variety of different, I'm fortunate to be visiting at Georgetown Law School this semester, which has been terrific. I don't think I'm a long-term academic. I'm more, I kind of like being in the arena more than teaching about it. But it's been absolutely fantastic to be there this semester. I've really enjoyed my interactions with students. In fact, I'll be back over there this afternoon. They're idealistic, they're not cynical yet. And particularly at Georgetown, what I found to be so great is that they're sort of drawn, this is obviously a gross generalization, but the students there are very drawn to public service, and we've had great conversations right now in today's environment about what being a lawyer means and how a lawyer can impact the world beyond the courtroom, and what special responsibilities go with being a lawyer that other folks, their friends who are going to business school don't necessarily have. And so it's been really energizing. I felt very fortunate to be there, but I don't think that's a long term.
And do you have a different view about public service now, given what's happened over these many months? Do you feel like it's more critical? Do you think people should approach it differently, more boldly? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's always been critical. One of the things, it's probably not a shock that I have some strong differences with this administration and things that are going on there. But one of the silver linings that I actually find out of this is how much more engaged people are. I don't just mean lawyers, I just mean regular people. How much more engaged people are and what's going on in our country, in our world, and sort of a sense of responsibility that people across the board seem to be feeling now to speak out and to be heard and to have a role in charting the direction of our country. That's a really good thing. And
I asked you earlier, and I do want to pursue this. I know when a lot of this was unfolding over the travel ban, and there was, a lot of horrified voices coming, particularly out of Europe, not just here, but internationally. But I also would hear out of Europe, wow, the institutions of America are really strong. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of, again, what you've learned about the American Constitution?
Yeah, I think the institutions in America are really strong, and I think that one of our primary responsibilities right now is ensuring that we maintain the integrity of those institutions. Administrations are going to have different policy views. I get that. Elections have consequences. We should expect that to happen. But there are certain fundamental things about, for example, and I won't go off on a long harangue on this, but the fundamental independence of the Department of Justice and the fact that the White House is supposed to have absolutely no involvement in investigations or prosecutions at DOJ. And when I say no involvement, I mean zero. There's not supposed to be a phone call from the president to the attorney general, for example, saying, hey, can you drop that Sheriff Arpaio case? There's not supposed to be a discussion from the president to the FBI director saying, can you drop that Mike Flynn investigation? The president is not supposed to be trying to goad DOJ into reopening an investigation of a former rival, Hillary Clinton. Those are things that it has been a time-honored tradition through both Republican and Democratic administrations. This is not a partisan thing, a time-honored norm and tradition that the White House stays out of the business of cases of DOJ. Broad policies, of course, there's some discussion, but stays out of that. And that's really essential to maintaining the rule of law and maintaining public confidence that criminal prosecutions are not being used to go after one's political enemies or to protect one's friends. And so I think that that's, while DOJ is holding, and I have great confidence in the people at the Department of Justice, I think that that's something that all of us have to be really vigilant about, that we don't want to normalize any of this behavior such that it lasts beyond just the confines of this administration.
Well, on those very eloquent words, thank you so much, Sally Yates. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
applaud. I'm gonna let them applaud for a minute for it.